So, chapter 3 is dealing with tissues, and we've talked about cells, which are the building blocks of um, basically the tissues and the organs and organ systems and organisms. So, we're going to go through tissues and just to kind of quickly go over that kind of hierarchical how things are structured or built, because anatomy really is dealing with the structure of something, and the structure determines the function of what that thing does. So atoms and molecules, they determine the structural components, right? And again, 99% and above of all the cells and cellular structures in your body are made up of carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, and oxygen. And these atoms combine to form molecules and different amounts. And these molecules form structures that end up making up the cell. The cell has a cell membrane, and everything inside the cell would be intracellular, and everything outside the cell would be extracellular. Now, when you have cells, and these cells are secreting and regulating with the fluid surrounding them, and that is called the interstitial fluids. When you have these groups of cells and the extracellular material or interstitial fluid surrounding them, then we now call it a tissue. And there are 4 primary tissue types. So the 4 primary tissue types are consisting of 1, epithelial. Epithelial covers exposed surfaces, lines internal passage, ways and chambers. So it would line the chambers or the chambers of your heart, like the atrial and ventricular chambers, or it also epithelial tissues around the outside of the heart as well. Epithelial tissue is your skin, right? So it covers exposed surfaces, or the inner lining of your mouth, inner lining of your esophagus, inner lining of your small intestines. So epithelium aligns things, whether outside or inside, and also produces glandular secretions. So all endocrine glands, when we get to endocrine system, are epithelial tissue. Also mucus glands, serous glands, sweat glands, salivary glands. So all of this is epithelium. Connective tissue is kind of a various group of tissues, everything from bones to tendons to blood to things like the dermis, or the kind of structural component of your skin. So these are structural in nature. They're either connecting things, they're filling spaces for structure, right? So filling things for structure. Adipose or fat cells are also connective tissue. So providing structure, support, shape, energy, strength in terms of the structure, like bones. Those are all connective tissue. Then we have muscle tissue and neural tissue, right? So muscle, there's 3 types. So there's smooth, cardiac, and skeletal. All of them make things move, right? So all 3 of those tissues contract, and smooth muscle pushes things through tubes. The heart contracts to push blood through your cardiovascular system or your circulatory system, and skeletal muscles contract to pull on the bones and act as levers to be able to have the organism move externally. The last one is neural tissue, and these neurons and neural glial cells produce and conduct electricity that will then excite another structure to release something, a chemical messenger, a hormone. And so this is kind of the electrical system of your body. In this chapter, in chapter 3, we are really only focusing on 1 and 2. Okay, so we're focusing on epithelial tissue and connective tissue. We will talk about muscle tissue when we talk about skeletal muscles and muscles in general, and we'll talk about neural tissue when we talk about the nervous system. Now, these tissues will combine to form organs, and then again, organ systems are more than one organ. So we start going through those organ systems when we start talking about the integumentary system and so forth. Okay, so this is the introduction. If it's in the PowerPoint mode, you get to kind of click and these different slides right here will pop up. This is kind of a nice overview. Remember, one of the things I want you guys to know besides the names of the structures is their functions, and definitions a lot of times tell you what their functions are. So here's a definition right here of tissues. They're collections of specialized cells and cell products that are organized to perform a fairly limited number of functions. And so that is a good definition to remember. They are specialized cells, groups of cells, collections of cells, and whatever surrounds them. That would be the cell products that surround them. And again, they're going to be epithelium, connective, muscle, or neural. You do need to know the primary tissue types, and you need to know basically what each of the 4 does specifically. And then we're really going to get into identifying and understanding epithelial tissue and connective tissue. So we'll start with epithelial tissue. Again, naming it is important and understanding the functions. So the functions of epithelial tissue provides physical protection. It's a lining tissue. So whether it's lining the outside of something or the inside of a tube or a heart chamber, it's still protecting whatever that organ is from the outside environment or the internal environment. And so protection is a big thing. I mean, we think about skin, right? We have layers of epithelium that just protect. These layers also control permeability. Permeability is a term meaning, we talked about it in chapter 2, being able to enter and exit is permeability. So these epithelial cells are going to decide what comes in and what goes out of the tube or organism or whatever it's lining. There are also receptors for sensory, right? So epithelium can have baroreceptors that sense the stretch, like your bladder. So you have these baroreceptors in the epithelium of the bladder, and as that epithelium gets bigger and more stretched, as more urine is sent down to the bladder, those receptors will get excited because they form action potentials based on how much they're stretched, and that nerve impulse will go into your brain and let you know that it's time to go to the bathroom. You also have skin receptors. So in your epidermis, the outer layer of your skin, you can feel when you have light touch. You can feel when it's windy and the little hairs are moving. You can feel when the temperature is changing on top of your skin. So there is sensation. And then secretions, again, glandular tissue is epithelium. So, so types of epithelial tissue, specifically glandular tissue, can secrete things, right? Mucus, sweat. I know I'm not writing this out. Salivary. These are examples, right? It's not a full list. So epithelial tissues, layers of cell that line an exposed surface or internal cavity or passageway. And it's really important to understand these functions, right? So there's now 2 slides going over the functions, and therefore it is important when you see multiple slides on something, it means study these, right? So I'm not putting multiple slides up for no reason, right? Another thing about this book I want you to understand is looking at the pictures and actually looking at all of these things that are included and then reading the captions. They're really, really well written, and sometimes you can go without reading the chapter, but if you're reading what's written under the diagrams and you're really understanding these diagrams, it can help you understand the anatomy as well. So don't overlook this little print under a picture. Look at the picture and then read the figure caption, and it helps you, right? Okay, so epithelial tissue has special characteristics, and these characteristics are special. Characteristics are special to epithelial tissue alone, right? That means that only epithelial tissues have these characteristics. Connective tissue does not have these characteristics, nor does muscle tissue, nor does neural. So let's go through these because these are important to understand as well. There's 5 characteristics that are special to epithelial tissue, and one is cellularity. Cellularity means that all the cells are the same, and they are tightly packed right next to each other, attached to one another with cell adhesion molecules with little or no space between the cells. So cellularity, all the cells are identical, meaning they're all the same type. So they're all the same types of cells. They're not different. So in connective tissue, you're going to see that you'll have some chondrocytes that are producing cartilage, or you'll have cells that are there in the connective tissue for immune defense, and you have some reticular fibers, and you might have a variety of cells in a connective tissue. That is not the case for epithelial tissue. Every single cell of that lining tissue or that epithelial tissue is going to be the same type of cell. Since it's a lining tissue, so that's one. Since it's a lining tissue, there's always going to be an exposed surface side of the cell and a side of the cell that's attached to underlying connective tissue, right? So one side is attached to underlying connective tissue, the other is exposed to environment or, passageway. So because one side is different from the other side, it's said to have polarity. So a lot of times we think of polarity as like a plus and a minus on a battery or something. They're different, right? So the exposed side is going to be different from the side that's connected to the underlying connective tissue. They're different. They look different. They have different features. For example, here this is showing you microvilli. These are just extensions of the cell membrane to increase the surface area for absorption. So you would find these in the digestive tract, right? Cilia you would find in the respiratory tract because they're little hairs that will kind of move and help move mucus up through your respiratory tract back up to your mouth so you can get rid of pathogens that might have stuck to mucus. These are all basically facing the outside or lining the internal passageway, and this is called the apical surface. And then the basolateral surfaces is connected to underlying connective tissue, okay? So they're different, they're completely different. That's polarity, difference on two sides. Attachment, again, epithelium has all the same type of cell, right? So this is a columnar cell, and this cell right here looks identical to that cell, which looks identical to this cell and that cell. So that's the cellularity component of it. Polarity is the basolateral sides look different than the apical surface, and they're all attached to one another. So you have these cell adhesion molecules, or CAMs, that are attaching cell 1 to cell 2 to cell 3 to cell 4 to cell 5. So all of these cells are attached to one another, and then they're attached to, again, underlying connective tissue underneath. And so there's kind of the epithelial part of the connection, and then there's the connective tissue part of the connection, and those two make up what is called the basal lamina. So epithelial tissue, it needs to maintain the integrity, meaning it's a barrier. So it's like if it's a fence and the fence is broken, it's no longer a very good barrier, right? If you're trying to fence in cows or livestock and the fence breaks, it's a problem. It's no longer a barrier, cows walk out. So epithelium being a barrier in your body, these cell adhesion molecules have to be maintained. The connections of the cells to one another have to be maintained, right? And so in order to do this, you have constant regeneration or renewal of cells. And their cell adhesion molecules, right? So you're constantly renewing epithelial cells. Epithelial cells are regenerative, right? And so that's this one right here. They regenerate. They have your epithelial tissue is constantly forming new cells. So they're constantly creating new cells, right? Because these cells need to maintain themselves and maintain themselves as a barrier. So you're constantly regenerating. So as epithelial cells get older or damaged because they're a lining tissue, so things are going to touch or rub up against it or go past it, they get old and they need to be replaced. So there's constant mitosis of germ cells or stem cells, basal cells, I should say, not quite stem cells, but they're not all stem cells, but they're cells that are regenerative or undergo mitosis in creating new cells, right? And so this regeneration is specific to epithelium. Now, connective tissue, tendons, ligaments, they don't regenerate. Adipocytes don't regenerate. You can just put more fat into a adipose site or fat cell. The fat cell just gets bigger, expands, but you're not regenerating those fat cells. You're not increasing them. You're just increasing the amount of stuff inside the cell. Bone is the one exception, bone and blood. Connective tissue, that is regenerative. But other than that, connective tissue is not regenerative. Muscle and neural is not regenerative. Once they're gone, they're gone. The last thing I didn't talk about is avascularity, meaning there is no blood flow going to the epithelium. So no blood flow to epithelium. A means without. This is because if it's a barrier and you have blood supply to the barrier, it's not a very good barrier because anything that damages that one cell can get into your bloodstream. So to be a protective lining tissue, there is no blood flow to that tissue. So it acts as a barrier and separates whatever is on the external exposed surface or apical surface from the underlying blood vessels in the connective tissue layer beneath it. So it's avascular. A means without blood flow. And so these cells have to get nutrients, oxygen, carbon dioxide, via diffusion. So from the connective tissue layer that is down below, the underlying connective tissue layer. So here has blood flow, right? So the blood supply is down here. And oxygen and CO2 and nutrients or whatever, right, has to diffuse up in order for cells to get nutrients. And so that's a big deal because when you have several layers, and we'll get into stratified, right? So stratified is number of cell layers. As new cells get produced or born, old cells get pushed up. And as they get pushed up, diffusion doesn't really work for long distances, and so these older cells start to die. And that is why the top layers of your skin are dead, because they're being pushed too far away from the underlying connective tissue where your blood supply is. That's why you can get, you can shave some of the top layers of your skin off and you're not going to necessarily bleed. There's no blood supply to the epidermis or the outer layer of your skin. It's epithelium. And epithelium is classified by the number of cell layers. So simple is one layer thick. And if it's more than one, it's called stratified or layered. The second way we classify epithelium is based on the shape of the cell. So cells are either shaped in what is called a squamous shell. I keep saying cell. Squamous cells kind of look like, to me, this looks like fried eggs, right? But I don't know, could look like something different to you. It's kind of got this shape like that, and then there's a nucleus. Cuboidal epithelium, they're basically cubes with a nucleus in the middle, right? So it's cuboidal. Columnar are like columns, right? So columns, they look like this, and then there's a nucleus. So they're like columns. And then glandular epithelium kind of looks like columns. This layer right here is the glandular epithelium. There, and so that's the epithelium. So classification of epithelium, you have simple squamous and stratified squamous. So simple squamous is one cell layer thick. Now, if it's one cell layer thick, right, that's not very thick. That's really thin. One cell layer is tiny. This is great because if you have blood supply here, and it needs to go here, like oxygen and carbon dioxide, you don't want a really thick barrier. You want it to be thin because diffusion doesn't work with thick barriers or long distances. So when you need rapid diffusion, one cell layer thick is great. And you find this in the alveoli of the lungs for gas exchange, right? So when you need to exchange gases quickly, you're going to have a really thin layer. So you find simple squamous in the lungs, or lining your blood vessels, especially the capillaries, when things have to get through the capillaries and back in a fast manner. Now, if you want to have a thick barrier, you are going to have stratified. So all of these cells right here are squamous. These cells right here look more robust because they're closer to the blood supply, which is here in the underlying connective tissue, right? And so these cells right here are getting nutrients. But these cells up here are not really getting oxygen, and so they start to die. So you find stratified squamous where you need very thick layers because there's a lot of mechanical stress, things passing over it. So the esophagus has food constantly passing over it, right? And your skin has all kinds of stuff in your mouth. Anyone that's ever eaten Captain Crunch knows anything that's too abrasive in the inside of your mouth, you start shredding up that stratified squamous layer. As far as cuboidal, cuboidal is good where you need to secrete and absorb things. You find these in the nephrons of the kidneys, right? So they're filtering blood, and so there's a lot of things moving out of the urine filtrate and back into the blood, and things from the blood going back into the urine filtrate. So that's secretion and absorption. Stratified cuboidal, we don't find very often. It's in a few sweat glands, exocrine type glands, and they're fairly rare. Transitional epithelium, these can, when they are not being stretched, look the same, but as this lining of the bladder gets expanded, as more urine is deposited in the bladder, they start to change shape, so they can transition or change shape, and so this is really only found in the urinary system. Columnar. Columnars, simple columnars found in the digestive tract, right? So small intestine, where, I can't even spell. Let's see. And so the small intestine, you're going to have the blood supply here in the underlying connective tissue, and here's where the food stuff that you ate, right, is getting broken down. So it's getting metabolized. Is happening, right? So breakdown. Microvilli are extensions of the cell membrane for increased surface absorption. So increased surface absorption, so you can absorb these nutrients across into the epithelial cell and then eventually into the blood. So you tend to find it where you have a lot of absorption going on, and you'll have features like microvilli on the apical surface, right? And this would be the basolateral surface. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar. It's kind of stratified in some places, but not in others. That's this right here. They're little cilia hairs, and those are those little mucus elevators, as I like to call them. And that's in the respiratory tract. And then stratified cuboid or columnar, excuse me, is again exocrine glands, only in a few salivary glands. So this is kind of showing you these pseudostratified ciliated columnar, right? So pseudostratified ciliated columnar. Ciliated columnar, and these are the cilia right here. And here's the mucus being pushed up. So it's showing you that. Glandular epithelium secretes things into ducts, and they could be endocrine or exocrine glands. So exo means to exit, endo means to stay inside. So exocrine glands are going to secrete things that go in and stay into the body, right? So they secrete things into the bloodstream. Exocrine glands secrete things into ducts that eventually leave the body. So this again would be like sweat or saliva or mucus. Also, like digestive enzymes are produced by exocrine because it goes into the small intestines and eventually leaves. So types of glands, they distribute or secrete things different ways. Merocrine secretes things through exocytosis. So we talked about exocytosis in chapter 2. Apocrine are going to have part of the vesicle break off. And so you have two types of sweat glands. You have merocrine sweat glands and apocrine sweat glands. Apocrine are the ones that kind of smell, right? So they're the smelly ones because part of the cell membrane structures are breaking off. Whereas merocrine, it's just exocytosing the sweat. So you don't have any cell particles. Then you have holocrine. That's where the entire cell just breaks open to release what's inside. And an example of that would be like sebaceous glands that are attached to your hair root. And we'll talk about sebaceous glands in chapter 4. So as far as gland structure, I just want you to kind of see the overview. I don't specifically test on structure of glands, but there are tubular and there are alveolar, and kind of a combination of the two. And they could be simple, one tube or one alveolar, or they can be compound, meaning there's several branches of them. So simple and compound, different types. All right, last we're going to talk about connective tissue. And now, again, remember, we're going to contrast it a little bit with epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue is cellular, right? So cellularity, all these cells are the same. That is very different from this. This is a sample of connective tissue. This is areolar. There's lots of different cells. These are fat cells. This is like a macrophage. These are fibers, right? So there's different types of fibers. This looks like a lymphocyte. That's a melanocyte. So there are multiple cells, and then there's stuff inside, in between the cells here, and that's just called the matrix, or what's inside it. So connective tissue has specialized cells. They're all different. They do different things. There's extracellular protein fibers, like these collagen fibers, or these little black reticular fibers. And then there's the stuff in between the fibers and cells, and that's called ground substance or matrix, extracellular matrix. So it depends on what type of connective tissue. That ground substance could be a solid, for example, bones, or it could be fluid, for example, blood, or it can be kind of in between, like an areolar tissue. Connective tissue varies because different types of connective tissue do different things, right? So skeletal system, bones provide structure, blood delivers things, right? Transports things, protect organs, fat, or the connective tissue, those more packaging and supporting things, can actually connect to things like tendons, connect a bone to a muscle, or ligaments connect a bone to a bone, can store energy like adipose tissue, and can also defend the body. White blood cells are connective tissue. And so you have three classifications. You have connective tissue proper, which means it properly connects to things. It actually connects things. So it takes thing one, I should say thing one, and it connects it to thing two, right? So actually connects things. Fluid connective tissue is just blood and lymph, and supporting connective tissue is supporting. So it's not connecting anything. It's just supporting. So that example of that would be cartilages. So hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, fibrocartilage. And again, connective tissue has these properties. Fixed cells, giving you an example of different types of fixed cells. Wandering cells, these are cells that are roaming around, generally for immune defense. These are all immune defender cells. There are also fibers. You have collagen fibers, or the thick rope-like ones, these right here. And then you have reticular fibers that are a little bit thinner and are for support, and elastic fibers, which have a little bit of stretch. And then the spaces in between these cells and fibers is referred to as ground substance. So there are charts that go through this, and you can read through those. It gives you kind of an overview of the functions of each. And as far as connective tissue, we start with connective tissue proper. So these are going to be your tendons, your ligaments, areolar tissue that's connecting one part or one organ to another organ. Adipose tissue, your subcutaneous layer, connects the dermis to underlying fascia that will surround your muscles. And reticular tissue as well. These tissues can be densely packed together with no space, or they can have lots of space in between them. So that's where loose and dense come in. All of them are going to have these three types of fibers. And so collagen fibers are going to dominate, say, a tendon. So you're going to have more collagen fibers in a tendon. Reticular fibers, you're going to have more in something that's like your liver, or areas where you're going to have more support. And so this goes through the three types of fibers. So collagen, strongest. Reticular, they're tough but flexible. They tend to hold their shape well. And so these can be thinner, but they are great for holding the shape of an organ, say like your liver. And then elastic fibers give a little bit of stretch. So these are good for tendons and ligaments, so they don't immediately rip when there's too much stress between two bones or bones and a muscle. As far as classification, again, it's loose or dense. And you just need to read through on the different types, right? So these fibers, what they're best for, adipose sites, energy storage. Areolar tissue is great for cushioning and supporting. Reticular, also great for providing a framework or structure to something. So these are structural, or providing energy, or supporting things. And so each goes through location, function, and what the matrix consists of. So I want you to go through areolar tissue, look at where it's located, look at its function, and what kind of matrix it has. Dense regular connective tissue tends to be things that actually are connecting. These are connective tissue proper. So tendons, and aponeurosis is just a flat tendon, but it's connecting a muscle to a muscle. Ligaments connect bone to bone, and they can be elastic, right? So they're supporting things. Dense irregular is like your dermis. And so it's dense, it holds things, it provides structure. It doesn't have a regular wavy shape like elastic and, um, and dense regular. Fluid connective tissue, blood and lymph. For obvious reasons, they are fluid, but they're dominated by cells that are produced in the skeletal bones, and so they are classified as a fluid connective tissue. Supporting connective tissue are the cartilages. So hyaline cartilage, this is the most common type of cartilage. Your bones actually start out hyaline cartilage and slowly get replaced with bone matrix as you grow. So we refer to it sometimes as the growth plate, is where there's still hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is also surrounding your synovial joints, like your knee and elbow and little digit joints. The cartilage that are on the ends of your bones where they articulate or connect is hyaline cartilage. So it's the most common kind. Your tracheal rings are hyaline cartilage. Elastic cartilage is more flexible but less supportive. So your ears, right? So something that's going to move. It's important to understand cartilage almost has little to no blood flow. And so that is why it doesn't bleed very much, but it also doesn't repair very well because it doesn't have good blood flow. Fibrocartilage is very dense and great for shock absorption. So your intervertebral discs are fibrocartilage, or your pubic symphysis connecting the two pubic bones in the front or anterior of your pelvis are fibrocartilage. And what you'll notice is cartilage has these chondrocytes or cartilage cells, and then this fibrous matrix that they produce in between. So you could say cartilage is dominated by chondrocytes, and there's kind of a fluid matrix that could be more solid or less solid depending on the type of cartilage. Bones have a tremendous amount of vascularity and they are regenerative. And we are going to talk about this more in chapter 5. So you don't really have to worry about it. We talk about bones in chapter 5. Membranes are important to understand that a membrane is part epithelium and part connective tissue. So membranes consist of both, right? So you have to have epithelium and connective tissue to have a membrane. You have mucous membranes, you have serous membranes, you have cutaneous membranes, and synovial membranes. We're going to talk about cutaneous membranes in chapter 4 because the cutaneous membrane is the epidermis, which is epithelium, and the underlying dermis. Remember, epi means on top of the dermis, and that is connective tissue. And so together, they're referred to as the cutaneous membrane because it is both epithelium and connective tissue. And so just to conclude, we have this framework of the body, right? So this outer layer is going to be epithelium, and then here, this layer here is going to be connective tissue. And then you have more connective tissue that is called the superficial fascia, which is also your hypodermis or your subcutaneous layer, right? Because it's below the cutaneous membrane. And so that's there. Deep to that is deep fascia, and deep fascia is a dense fibrous kind of connective tissue framework that basically bounds capsules, tendons, ligaments that are surrounding muscles. And then you have your layers of muscle, right? So these are muscles. And then lining the body cavities are superserous fascia, right? So these line ventral body cavity membranes. And so we have this framework. Muscle tissue, we're going to get into this when we get into chapter 9 and greater, and neural tissue when we get to chapter 13 and greater, so you don't really have to worry. I would just read the captions. I'd read this, this, and this, and understand it. It's pretty self-explanatory, and just basically what the nervous tissue does. Bummer about aging in tissues is connective tissue doesn't hold up too well, and epithelium also becomes less regenerative as you age. Cardiac and muscle, neural tissue doesn't really regenerate at all, so that just wears out over time. Not very fun, kind of a bummer. All right, that concludes chapter 3. All right, one more chapter.